In this segment, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pediments of the Parthenon, the pediments of the east and of the west. And behind me, you can see part of the pediment of the east side of the Parthenon. We're going to be talking about that in just a minute. But before we do so, let's just remind ourselves of what the pediments are and how they fit into the architecture of the building at large. I want to remind you here about the orientation of the building and the fact that we enter the Parthenon from the east side. It's fundamental to the kind of whole kind of direction and directional force of the sculpture is that we enter it from the east side. So the sculptures that you can see behind me are the ones that we would see just as we would enter into the main pronaos, the main naos or keller, the main building of the temple itself. By contrast, what we would see on the west pediment, which is the pediment on the other side of the Divine Gallery, is what you would see first when you enter the Acropolis itself, when you work your way through the propylaea and see the building for the first time. And I think that differentiation is really important for starting to think about the subjects of the West and of the East. And I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the West. But before I do so, a quick reminder about the history of the afterlife of the Parthenon and one key date for you, 1687. Do you remember earlier on we said about how a Venetian bombardment destroyed the main architectural fabric of the building, blowing off the roof, but also destroying the central parts of the pediments themselves. So what you can see here with the large gap in the Divine Gallery itself is actually just the sides of the pediment. And that's really important to remember that you've got to remember that the middle section of the west and of the east pediments are missing. Okay, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the west side, so the side that you can see on the other side of the Divine Gallery. Here we seem to have a scene of tension, a scene of rivalry between the two deities of Athena and Poseidon. This is the story of who is going to have control over Athens and why it's called Athens in the first place. Because according to ancient mythology, Poseidon and Athena both wanted to be the patron deity of Athens. Athena won out. But what we see on the west side is the tension, the competition between the two gods. Poseidon offers the people of Athens a salt spring on the Acropolis. Athena offers them the olive, that great agricultural fruit of ancient Greece. And perhaps no surprise, Athena wins. And what you see or what you once saw on the west pediment is that moment of tension. Who's going to win between the two? But it's also a moment of tension that's framed in terms of place. And for me, the west pediment of the Parthenon is all about place, all about reminding you of where you are in Greece. Think, for example, of the corner figures that you can see demonstrated here on the left-hand side of the west pediment with this reclining figure. Now here it's really important to remember a problem of pediments as a phenomenon of Greek architectural form. You've got to remember that as you go towards the centre of your gable, you've got a much larger space. So how do you ensure unity of scale from the sides to the top? And here on the west side, as indeed on the east pediment, you can see the ingenious solution that the sculptors of the pediments came up with, namely to have reclining figures. So as you move towards the corner of the gable, you have these figures occupying the space, but no smaller in scale than those in the middle. The smallness, the diminutive scale, comes from the fact that they're reclining. And this is all about place, in that what we see here on the west pediment, on this particular figure, seems to be a personification of the river Ilissos. There seems to have been another personification on the other side of the pediment, really rooting you in Athens as a place. Just remember that competition between Athena and Poseidon at the center of the pediment, reminding you of those divine gifts that were offered to Athens right on the Acropolis itself. So everything here on the west pediment is reminding you of where you are. Now the contrast with the east pediment seems to me striking, because if the west is all about place, what we have on the east pediment is a pediment that's all about time, about a particular motion. If the west pediment is about attention, here we find a kind of resolution. And I think what's completely fundamental to this composition here is the design of the corners. Here, as on the west pediment, you can see a reclining figure. He's sometimes referred to as figure D. I think to you or me, he's known as Dionysus. We have to imagine this is the god of wine. And here he is reclining and holding a cup originally in his hand. But to the left of that figure, you can see a pair of horses. And you can see to the left a figure just emerging into the very corner of the pediments. All you can see are his arms, but this is the figure of sun, of Helios, sun coming up, of dawn breaking. And by contrast, on the other side, so on the right side as you look at it here in the British Museum, what you saw was a scene of the sun setting and of Selene, so the goddess of the moon, bringing nighttime. That's to say that on the corners here, everything is being framed around a temporal scale, a temporal dimension, and a particular moment. And that moment would have been originally portrayed right in the center of the pediment. In the center, you would have once seen here the figure of Zeus giving birth to the figure of Athena, namely, therefore, the patron goddess of the city herself. The story here goes something like this. Zeus has an affair with Metis, who's cunning. The name is cunning in Greek, Metis. And Zeus knows that any progeny, any offspring that he has with Metis will outsmart him when that offspring is born. And so Zeus comes up with the ingenious idea of devouring, of eating, of consuming Metis, which seems like a good idea until Zeus gets a terrible headache. At that moment, Hephaestus, the godsmith of antiquity, comes along with his axe, and he chops open Zeus's head, and out springs fully formed Athena. What we have here then is a particular moment, the moment of the birth of Athena herself, a moment that's framing not just the composition of the pediments, but also the moment when we ourselves would enter into this building of the Parthenon. So everything here is about time. Before moving on to some of the other sculptural forms of the Parthenon, I want to say two things about the particular figures that are here on the eastern side. The first thing I want to say is about the mastery of drapery. Here on the east side of the Parthenon, on the east pediment of the Parthenon, you can see Greek sculptors really coming to grips with what you can do with drapery as a sculptural form. Archaeologists sometimes talk here about model lines, about drapery lines, about chain lines, and so on and so forth. But the key point is instantly recognizable. The drapery here is accentuating every aspect of the body. It's almost see-through in its scale, allowing us to see all of the details of the goddesses underneath. So, for example, if you look at the figures behind me, sometimes referred to as Persephone and Demeter, you can see that the drapery here is accentuating the female form. And I think that's something that you find even more pronounced as you move to the other side of the pediment, as you can see here in these nice close-ups, where you can see the drapery of figures that are sometimes referred to as Aphrodite and her mother Dione, here accentuating the bodily form. This is Greek sculpture really coming to maturity with drapery as an artistic form. At the same time, the drapery here is really accentuating the action of the birth of Athena itself. Look, for example, at the tension here with the figures between how their bodies are positioned and their turn of the head. Look, for example, at this figure, sometimes referred to as the figure of youth, or the figure of the cupbearer of Zeus himself. And you can see how drapery here is accentuating the idea of movement within the pediment. This is a pediment that's coming to life with the birth of Athena itself. The second element that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the fact of what you can see as you move around the pediment. Here you've got to remember that the pediment, by definition, is something that you can only ever see from the front. And yet, if you walk around the sculptures here in the Parthenon galleries in the British Museum, you can see how the sculptures are adorned on the back as well as at the front. Now, this is kind of sculptural nonsense. It doesn't make any sense to us because this is something that would never have been seen to original viewers, or at least viewers of these sculptures when it was up on the Parthenon. And yet, even on the back, you can see details of anatomy, you can see details of drapery being carved into the sculptures themselves. It's almost as though the sculptors of this monument could imagine people like you and me looking at the sculptures in a kind of museum setting. Again, if you're thinking pragmatically, this doesn't make any sense, not within the fabric of the building. And yet, at the same time, these are sculptures that seem to be catering to a different sort of gaze, perhaps even a divine gaze, a gaze of the gods, a gaze that could see the details of the back as well as of the front.